Hey there, listeners. Galen here. I heard from plenty of you who appreciated last week's episode about class in American politics. And I just wanted to kick this show off by saying that if you got something out of it and want more shows like it, consider becoming a paid subscriber at gdpolitics.com. As a paid subscriber, you'll have full access to all of our episodes, plus videos and more. About last week's episode, Simon said, "I loved this episode, Galen. Please take every opportunity to interview articulate academics like Joan whenever you can. This justified a year of monthly subscriptions." Riley said, "Absolutely one of my favorite podcast episodes I've listened to." And Kenny said, "I'm sending it to all of my friends." To join the folks who make this podcast possible, head to gdpolitics.com and become a paid subscriber today. All right, here's the show. When did we work together? Like, how long ago did you leave 538?
January or February 2017 was when I left. So I know I remember we overlapped quite a bit, but particularly I recall the 2016 election.
Wait, what was that?
I think it was mostly a local. It was like city councils.
Yeah. Like it was like this municipal election. Like nobody really paid attention. In fact, I don't even think 538 did a forecast of it because it was so like no one was paying attention.
No, yeah, Nate was really more on the sports beat at that point, yeah.
Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Drew. What do Americans think about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act? And is the acronym pronounced OBBA or ABBA? I think for our purposes, we're going to go with ABBA. So will this be a case of the winner takes it all, or will this be Republicans Waterloo? I don't know how many of our listeners are ABBA fans, but that one was for you. And hey, at least I didn't make any Dancing Queen jokes. I think I'll probably save those for when Trump pardons George Santos. Anyway, that aside, the House narrowly passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act just before Memorial Day. Senate Republicans now have to figure out what they want to do with it. And while they do that, we're going to figure out how Americans are reacting to it. We'll also look at what Americans think of Trump's broader agenda, so much of which is being enacted through executive actions. We've got a lot of polling from our friends at YouGov to help us do that. And they've also got a new survey out testing Americans' self-regard. Do Americans think they're trustworthy, smart, good at driving, good at running? And how do the sexes view themselves differently? Here with me to get into it all is Carl Bialik, U.S. politics editor and VP of data science at YouGov. Welcome to the podcast, Carl.
Thanks, Galen. Glad to be here.
For what it's worth, I should say you are also a former 538 colleague from way back when. So I think this is probably your first time on the podcast since you left 538 so many, many years ago.
I think that's right. I'm excited for this overdue reunion.
Yeah, I know. Okay. Also here with us is Taylor Orth, Director of Survey Data Journalism at YouGov. It's great to have you as well.
Very happy to be here.
Before we get into any of this silly politics stuff, we have some serious business to discuss. YouGov recently had the courage to ask Americans about one of the most pressing issues facing the country, and that is banana etiquette, which is to say, which side of the peel do you open a banana from? And is it okay to pull one banana off from the bunch at a grocery store? And then most importantly, what color should the peel be when you eat a banana? Overall, a majority of Americans responded with dignity. Open it from the stem side when it's yellow, and yes, you can break off a single banana from the bunch at the store. This is an area of American life with no discernible partisan differences, no gender differences, but there were some age differences. So 18 to 29-year-olds were the only age group that said it is unacceptable to break off a banana from the bunch at the grocery store. They were the most likely to say they open a banana from the opposite side from the stem, and they were the least likely to say they prefer yellow bananas. By only a couple points, but just slightly more preferred green bananas or even brown bananas. So here's my question. Maybe we can start with you, Carl. What the
Well, this certainly isn't the only thing where we find pretty big age differences. I'm sure on this show and in our lives, we're often talking about the party differences. But when we get to something that is, at least at this point, still nonpartisan, like banana etiquette.
At least at this point. I'm glad, at least at this point. But who knows? After this conversation, things could really go haywire.
Exactly. As soon as there's the big, beautiful Banana Act that is, supported by one party over the other, it'll change things. But yeah, there are enormous age differences in general in this country. I had very little preconceived notion of what the gap would be, but I'm not surprised that age is sort of the axis here on which people are dividing.
Taylor, do you have any key insights into why Americans are divided by age over banana etiquette?
Yeah, I honestly would have expected the opposite, because you might think young people, if they're living alone, that they might be the ones who want to break off one banana. Whereas older people, you might expect to have more family around larger households, and they might be more likely to want to buy a bunch. So I was a little surprised, I'll be honest, that it was the younger folks who were less accepting of taking the single banana.
That's a pretty rigorous analysis. I do have to ask you, I know that sometimes with these online opt-in polls, you can get weird things that happen, especially along sometimes age lines or race lines. Like the classic example is it was something like 25% of Hispanic men said that they were licensed to operate a nuclear submarine in an experiment that Pew Research did using these kinds of panels. Like, do you worry at all that this is misrepresenting the younger population, or do you feel confident that this is an actual age-based divide in America?
We are always thinking about data quality. With these polls, we're applying the same rigorous filtering of respondents based on number of signals. So we're as confident in this as we are in any of the results we release, which we're quite confident in. In this particular case, I think for any poll, if you see that something is a very fringe position, then there's a risk that, putting aside this question of age or, certain groups of respondents, it's possible that the people who have selected this very rare response are not following quite as closely, not paying close attention, not taking it quite as seriously. But in this case, even though there was a clear position that was more popular for all these important banana questions, there was on the other side enough people, even in the older age groups, that I just think there actually is a solid group of Americans who, let's say, open bananas on the side that I never would have thought of. And in fact, when we put this out on social, I was expecting a lot of, how could anyone think of opening a banana on the side that doesn't have the stem? But it was actually the other group that was very vocal and was saying, can't believe that 72% of Americans are wrong about this. And this morning I was opening a banana for my 2-year-old daughter and tried the other side based on these poll results and the social media reactions, and it worked really well. And she helped. So anyway, I think in this case, I'm quite sure that there are a lot of Americans who open bananas that way and are never going back.
Well put. And to be clear on the numbers here, it was 72% of Americans say they open it from the end with the stem, and 20% said they open it from the other end. I have a general question here, because YouGov oftentimes poses questions like this that don't have anything to do with politics, but may get at some funny divide in American life or pithy divide in American life. Have you ever posed one of these questions and been like, oh, this result is actually profound? I'm really glad we asked this question because I understood the public better because of it.
I think it happens often. I mean, not to be self-promotional about, but I think it's more just that I don't really know what to think people think about things at this point. I had much more confidence when I entered this job that I knew what people would think about things. And now if we're putting out questions, it's because we genuinely don't know. I mean, of course, there are the cases where we are trying to validate our own opinions about these hot button debates, but even then we're often surprised. But just to give an example, I was going to the dentist last week and I was brushing my teeth and I was thinking, isn't it kind of strange that I do that, because the dentist is going to see what my teeth look like and clean them, and that's why I'm there and that's what they're good at. So we asked, how many do you typically do that? Would you typically do that before going to the dentist? And I thought it would be most people do it, but it'd be something like the banana result, maybe 72-20. And it was 95% say they do that. And there are very few things that 95% of Americans say they do. So to me, that was a profound united front that Americans are putting on in terms of pre-dentist behavior. And it shook me. It really did. So anyway,
Wait,
I found that to be profound.
Carl, shame is universal, right? Everyone will feel shameful of their stinky, stinky breath if they walk it into the dentist's office and expect them to take care of it. That feels intuitive to me. But I'm glad.
You would have, before we run it, if we had said, Galen, what's the percent? You would have said around 95%.
And frankly, if you aren't, like, get
what's wrong with you?
And don't go to the dentist. Like, don't put your dentist through that.
They're wearing masks and getting paid quite a lot for that.
I was just thinking about relatedly, Carl. We asked a while back about whether or not people lie to their dentist about flossing their teeth. A lot of dentist-related etiquette we've done before, and found around 40% of people say that they at least sometimes lie to their dentist about how often they floss.
Only 40. Okay, raise your hand. For the podcast listeners, they're not going to know the answer to this. This is only for people who are watching the video. Raise your hand if you were on this call and you have lied to the dentist about your flossing routine. All right, there's our result.
But
if you want to know the result, go check out the video.
I mean, one of the things about how we present poll results that we try to be careful about is to say 40% say they lie. So if we're asking about lying behavior, we might be missing some people who both aren't honest with the dentist and aren't going to be honest with pollsters, even if we never meet them or, get to shame them. But I also think, I'm glad that you flagged shame, Galen, because I think there's like a broader polling topic we need to dig into more about like shame as a consideration and motivation when it comes to dentists and doctors. I think some people will avoid visiting doctors at all because they're afraid of shame about their weight or about something else. And we've touched on this in various polls, but I think it is actually a pretty important topic, maybe stemming from a somewhat less weighty prompt that we started with here.
Yeah, I will get back to me when you have those shame-based results. Come back on and we'll talk about them. But for now, let's talk about ABBA. Do you guys have a favorite song from their discography? No, have I encountered a non-ABBA crew?
I mean, most of what's in my head is from the two movies. Also, my daughter loves the music, but I don't know which would be the one song.
So it's
Taylor,
probably Dancing Queen.
I don't. Probably Dancing Queen.
Probably.
That would be what I would say.
All right. Yeah. We're saving that for our friend George. Okay. Anyway, jokes aside, as the name suggests, there is a lot in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. It extends the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It cuts taxes in some other business-friendly ways and on some types of incomes, including lifting taxes on tips up to a point. It eliminates several green energy tax initiatives. It introduces work requirements for Medicaid and supplemental nutrition programs, and boosts spending on border security and defense, as well as some other things. How much awareness about this bill is there amongst the public, Taylor?
Well, there's a lot in the bill, so it is difficult to measure overall how much people know about the bill. I can point to one question we ask about whether or not it will increase or decrease the deficit. And current estimates, as far as I'm aware of, do show that the bill is expected to increase the deficit to some extent. And we find that 37% of Americans say that the new budget will increase the deficit, whereas around 1 in 5, 20% say it will decrease it, and around 16% say that it will stay about the same. And, with Democrats, most of them say that the budget will increase the deficit, whereas Republicans are pretty split on this question. 40% say it will decrease the deficit, and the rest are split between saying it will increase it or keep it about the same. So on the deficit, on that end of their knowledge of what's going to happen with the bill, there's kind of mixed perceptions.
Yeah, we have asked people if they think it will increase their tax burden, and also if they think it will increase tax burdens defined broadly, like across poor people, middle class, the wealthy. And there is a lot more expectation of increase of tax burden by the public than there is baked into the bill. I think maybe another way to get at sort of like awareness is that a lot more people support extending the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act than oppose it, but the budget itself is opposed quite a bit more than it's supported. That's not the only aspect of the budget, but I think that also gets at kind of the difficulty in asking about bills where they're given names that sound really good, even if you haven't given them an acronym that's tied to a very popular Swedish band. And to some extent, we kind of sometimes we have to ask about the bill by name, but the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act sounds great. Like, people like both those things quite a bit if you pull them separately. But asking about the current budget is less popular because, budget is like a more neutral concept.
Yeah. I mean, there's some different threads here that we can pull. You asked overall Americans, do you support or oppose Trump's budget? It was 43% oppose, 36% support overall, and 21% had no opinion. So at the very least, it seems like 20% of Americans are willing to say they don't know enough about it to form an opinion on it. And I have to imagine that a lot of the people who are saying they support or oppose are reacting more to the fact that the question includes President Trump's proposed budget than knowing the details in it. To your point, Carl, one of the most striking details I found was that 2-to-1, Americans believe that this will increase their tax burden. So it was like 40% of Americans say it will increase their tax burden, 20% say it will decrease their tax burden. No matter what you think about this bill in totality, like you maybe oppose it because you don't want a more business-friendly tax environment or to decrease taxes on the wealthy, nonetheless, this is not going to increase Americans' taxes 2-to-1. So what is going on there? Like, how do we parse through what Americans actually believe or want when we see either things that are out of step with reality or things that are even contradictory? Like you mentioned, there's a good deal of support for extending the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, while not quite a bit of opposition, but at least by 7 points opposition to this budget.
Yeah, we did ask it again in the following week's Economist YouGov poll, and it had slipped a bit. So it is now, I think, 36% support, 47% opposed. There's probably a lot of colliding factors here. Some of it is just general lack of awareness of the bill, maybe a sort of generic association of the word budget with like, well, that means spending, and so that has to be paid for somehow. Maybe an experience with past budgets from past administrations during someone's adult lifetime that have involved tax increases at times. Just about any question where we let people react in some way to something labeled with the Trump administration, people who are staunch opponents of that administration are going to choose, some of them are going to choose the option that is negative. And in this case, that would be a tax increase for a lot of them. And we deliberately on these questions give people a range of options. So you can say, I'm strongly opposed, or you can say, I'm somewhat opposed. And if you don't know very much about it, but you do know that it's a Trump proposal and you know that you generally oppose anything that Trump proposes, then you can be somewhat opposed without knowing a whole lot about it. So, I think that's some of what could inform it, but it is surprising. I mean, I think 40% is also, it's a lot more than the people who say we'll decrease it, but it's also a lot less than half. So there are at least a lot of people who aren't saying that they expect that to happen. The only other thing that comes to mind is, the best laid plans. Maybe some people think, well, this proposal says it's not going to increase taxes, but because of, the nature of government spending and that it's expected to increase the deficit and so on, down the line, it's going to increase my taxes, even if it doesn't right away. So there may be some sort of like skepticism or cynicism baked in here as well.
I'll add that people are most likely to expect for the bill to increase taxes on the middle class, and most Americans identify as middle class. So I think that, if you put those two facts together, it's not as surprising that people expect their tax burden will increase.
Yeah, and you sort of broke it down and asked about support for cutting government spending on different social programs or even agencies, going piece by piece. Taylor, what did you find there?
Overall, we found this repeatedly, that cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security are very unpopular. Americans generally want these programs to be given more funding rather than less funding. So on that front, any sort of attempts to cut those things are going to be unpopular. In terms of other government agencies and departments, we generally find that Americans also want more funding for things like the Department of Education, Health and Human Services, and generally want decreased funding for the IRS. support for decreasing funding for DOGE is especially popular. We found repeatedly that is the agency Americans are most likely to want cuts to, which is not that surprising given that it's new and is itself implementing cuts.
Cut the cuts. You did something interesting, Taylor, where you asked this without giving people information about how much money the government currently spends on these agencies or programs. Then you asked a different group of people. You said, okay, this is how much we're already spending. Now, do you think we should increase or decrease funding? And how did that change Americans' reactions?
What we found in this experiment was that when we showed people the current budget, they were less likely to say that they wanted increased funding for defense. And I think when you see the bar chart that we showed people, you can see that defense kind of funding is far larger than the other areas. And so I think by being shown that, it led people to, I think, who may not have known the extent to which those differences existed, that experiment, when they were shown that, led them to be less supportive of increasing funding for defense. We didn't see that many differences for other departments in that experiment. So the primary effect was on defense in that instance.
Today's podcast is brought to you by you, dear listener. When you become a paid subscriber at gdpolitics.com, there's a little message you can fill out explaining why you chose to subscribe and support the podcast. One of the main themes you've mentioned is rigor. That's important to me, and it makes me really happy to hear that it's important to you. Steven says, you and the 538 podcast helped me better understand politics and the world for years. I couldn't imagine not having the same rigorous, data-driven analysis on politics in my life and in my ears. Kayla said, one of the most trusted voices in American politics and public opinion in a world where accessible, evidence-based media is fleeting, Galen offers digestible, insightful analysis. Wow, thanks, Kayla. Warren says, Galen offers calm data presentation and guides us through context, possible causalities, and potential implications. This thinking process becomes second nature, making listeners into more critical consumers of media. Wow, Warren, put on my tombstone. Glenn says, the least lean of anyone on TV. You don't take yourself too seriously. I'm over 80 and you don't talk in speak that I can't understand. Well, I'm not on TV anymore, but I do appreciate it nonetheless. And lastly, Odin Hobbler, I think that's how you say your name, says, I like your data-driven approach. I'm not even in the US, but I am a political scientist, and here in Germany, there doesn't even exist an equivalent in podcasts. Join these listeners by becoming a paid subscriber today at gdpolitics.com. In fact, do it right now. We will still be here when you get back. That's gdpolitics.com, and thank you. You mentioned that there is not a lot of support. There's plenty of antipathy towards cutting Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the like. But the focus of this bill is to implement work requirements on Medicaid and SNAP benefits, as well as some other changes. I think there are federal caps on Medicaid funding. When you look at polls that ask just that, you get an outright majority of Americans who support work requirements for Medicaid, 60%, according to recent New York Times polling. And in fact, it was almost 50% of Democrats. It was like 47% of Democrats supported work requirements for Medicaid, which sounds obviously a lot different than cutting spending, but is ultimately, in some ways, at least looking at how this budget nets out or considers funds saved, is the end result. So how should we think about that? Like, Americans don't want to cut Medicaid spending, but they do support work requirements.
Yeah, I think that they were asked separately, and it would be interesting to find out what would happen if you'd sort of asked them back to back. But I also think they can be consistent positions that a lot of Americans have, in that they could say, for the people who we think generally deserve this government support, they should be getting more. And so, maybe there are a lot of them who aren't even signed up because it's hard to sign up. Their state isn't implementing it well enough. That, there are lots of ways that sort of Medicaid could be expanded to people who do meet new, tougher requirements, and maybe overall expanded. while also maybe satisfying some people's preference for having it feel more fair or justified, who's getting this benefit. I also think like a lot of people sort of don't think quite as mathematically when they're answering these questions. And it's more to say increased funding is a way to say that you support this program, that you think it's good that people get the benefits, and you're not thinking of it in terms of, overall federal outlay should go up by 10% or something. But yeah, I mean, I do think that the questions like that on work requirements sort of tap into a very common feeling of people need to deserve to get this benefit in order to get it, whereas a question about funding taps into more of sort of the compassionate side of we should be giving people who do deserve this the support they need.
I think that makes a lot of sense. But I think we are also sort of touching on something that's a little bit tricky here, which is if you want to figure out how Americans feel about policy proposals, a bill, an executive action, you have to figure out how to ask them. And as we've shown here, the way that you ask will shape what results you get, which is why when we talk about polling policy, things can get messy quickly, right? If you ask, are you voting for Trump or Harris? People understand what that means. There's only so many ways that you can ask about support for one or the other. But in a case like this, if, for example, a progressive firm wants to get a result showing that Americans overwhelmingly support increased federal spending for social programs, Data for Progress can go out in the field and ask sort of all the kinds of ways that will encourage people to respond based on the empathy or whatever bias that people may have. Whereas someone else, another organization, say Americans for Prosperity, can go out and say, okay, we want to ask all about sort of concern for future generations and the tax burden on them and, generational equality arguments and things like that. And you can just get radically different results. So you have done a ton of polling on policy, Trump's policies, both this and what we'll get to next, which is his executive actions. How do you go about deciding what language to use?
You really have to strike a careful balance. We've been tracking since the start of Trump's second term, most, I won't say all, because I'm sure we've missed some, but of the policies that he has either proposed, enacted, executive orders he's signed. In doing that, we have faced this dilemma of how can you word these policies in a way that, in our case, I would say that our goals are to phrase the policies as neutrally as possible, as accurately as possible in terms of getting close to what the policy is both doing and how Trump is conveying it. And also to keep the language concise and clear and understandable so that respondents can understand the language, trying not to use jargon or inflammatory language in our phrasing of them.
One thing I also saw is you tried to exclude Trump from the questions, which maybe gets at what we were talking about before. The minute people see Trump, they're primed to respond a certain way. So they're not even necessarily told that this is something that Trump is proposing when you ask about these policy questions, right?
That's correct. Yeah, we have experimented with that, and we did find that when Trump's name is attached, it decreases support by around 2 points on average across the policies,
and polarizes support a bit, as you would expect. Yeah. I mean, I think experimenting is a good point to bring up because we do try to do all the things Taylor said, but we're never going to get it completely right. It is really hard, like you said. So some of that is we do tests. We try out different question formats with the same policy. We try different wording. We can't test every single one because Taylor's run this on 283 policies since the start of the year. But, I think our general approach is we don't give context like this is a Trump proposal. And we also try not to say this is a change from how it has been or, to sort of we don't want people to be swayed too much by well, this is what the norm is. We don't want to tell them what the norm is. We want them to react based on what the actual action is, which, is totally debatable. I do think on a lot of things, besides mentioning Trump, on a lot of things that we test, they just don't make that big of a difference, that people actually do sort of get what we're saying. So that sort of gives me some assurance. You gave examples of how firms could maybe swing things in a certain direction, and it's definitely possible. But when I've seen that, it's often involved a lot of text, a lot of background of what people say about it and so on. And in terms of these more these smaller differences in a sort of 10-word description of a policy, my general impression is that it doesn't swing things that much.
Okay, well, on that topic, you said 283 policy proposals you've asked Americans about since the start of Trump's second term. And so much of this has been through executive action because, as we know, there has been a historical low in terms of legislation making it through Congress this time around. I'm curious, Taylor, what overarching trends you've seen in terms of what Americans think of Trump's proposals.
Overall, net support is more negative than positive, meaning that more Americans on average oppose the policies than support them. The average net support is negative 17. One thing that we did was to code the policies into different categories. Since we have such a large number, one benefit to that is even if there are language differences or things you might be concerned about within individual policies, aggregating them up is one way to kind of see how Trump's doing across these different areas. And one thing we did with that was to code these policies. We coded them into individual categories. So, for example, we find that his worst performance is on healthcare, energy and the environment, executive power, and foreign policy. Whereas the only area in which he had net positive support was on LGBT issues, things like banning transgender athletes from women's sports, bathroom laws, things like that. Separately, we also coded the policies into whether or not they involved government cuts. One thing we realized pretty quickly was that a lot of the policies were things being enacted by DOGE, cuts to staff, funding of various agencies that involved a lot of the policies. So we also separately looked at that. And what we found was the policies that, which was about a quarter of the policies that involved these cuts, those policies were especially unpopular, about twice as unpopular as policies overall. Even among Republicans, support for the different types of cuts was almost breaking even, about +3, which is relatively low to what one might expect.
And this is not all stuff that's been enacted. A lot of it is proposals as well that have not yet been enacted. And a lot of the stuff that has been enacted will make its way through the courts and may not ever end up enduring. But when you take out those spending cuts and just look at sort of other kinds of proposals, are there areas where he is popular beyond LGBTQ issues? Like it looks like the closest he gets is on immigration and the economy.
Yeah, there are some things like, for example, the no taxes on tips, eliminating taxes on Social Security benefits. Both of those are popular. There are some policies that are popular other than the LGBT issues, especially on the economy and immigration, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think precisely because these aren't all enacted, or many are never going to be enacted, and the sort of awareness that people have of these is going to vary a lot. While we did take these sort of straight averages, and I think they are really informative, it could be that somebody who dislikes most of these policies also doesn't know that most of them are associated with Trump or doesn't actually care about those that much, even though they dislike them, and could still overall be supportive of Trump's policy agenda. So it is like a tricky thing to aggregate. The best we can do is the kind of straightforward average. But if you had heard about the eliminating taxes on tips and feel like that's great, or the elimination of the penny, then maybe you think, wow, he's really onto something, without having heard much about a lot of the ones you don't like.
Yeah, and underneath this, there's so much variation. So I'm just looking at the wonderful data that you've put together, which folks can check out. For example, checking the electronic devices and social media accounts of people entering the U.S. and using what is found to disallow entry to those who have been critical of Trump administration policies. Net approval for that, net support is -44, so very unpopular. Allowing immigration officials to use IRS tax data to identify immigrants suspected of being in the country illegally, +13. So underneath I think it netted out to be something like net -6 on his immigration policies. There's a lot of things where there's plenty of support, and there's a lot of things where there's less support. which gets to a question, some of us suspected that there could be a thermostatic backlash to Trump once he takes office and enacts the things that he's been saying he would enact. Have you seen any slippage? Like, do you go back and ask over time on immigration, on the economy, on healthcare, LGBT issues, if Americans are sort of warming to them or cooling to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've gone back on a handful of issues. That the pace of new policies and new policy proposals is enough for us to keep up with, that we haven't gone back that often. I think we should, especially on some of the early ones. Also, some of these are almost exactly or closely tied to things that Trump was saying on the campaign trail. And so we have been able to sort of compare some of those individually and collectively. And his proposals during the campaign were less popular overall than Harris's, but quite a bit more popular, I'd say, than the ones we've been tracking during his second term, which you could say is kind of normal, right? Like, you should put forward your most popular stuff during the campaign, and then you try to enact lots of things that maybe you didn't want to talk about. That's not an unusual arc. But we've also tracked what people think of his handling on issues generally, and on pretty much everything, they've gone down from the start of the term. Although some of them have started to bounce back a bit since kind of the lows around the tariff announcements.
And I also found, you mentioned comparing Harris's policy agenda to Trump's during the campaign. I thought that was really interesting. So yes, on net, Harris's proposals were more popular, but when you separated them out according to what Americans cared most about, it was Trump whose policies actually performed better, right? Like, if you looked at the economy, immigration, things like that, Trump performed better than Harris. Where Harris had a lot of, it was, like, what was it? Eliminating excess fees on, like, when you purchase tickets was like one of the most popular. I mean, that was part of the Biden agenda too. But like, some of these maybe less salient things pulled incredibly well, but aren't really what motivate partisan conflict in America, if that makes sense.
I will say something we recently looked at was kind of plotting approval of Trump on various issues by how important Americans think those issues are. And what we saw there was kind of an opposite trend for Democrats and Republicans. So Republicans approve of what Trump is doing most on the issues that they care about most. Whereas for Democrats, it's the opposite. The issues that they care about most are the issues that they're least likely to approve of Trump on. So you kind of see a reversal there in the two, given the two for each party.
Yeah, I guess that also makes sense. Which I want to get to some of the more contemporary debates in the past weeks or so about Trump. Have you had the opportunity to poll Americans on Trump's conflict with Harvard, or starting to, rescind student visas for college students from China, for example? How are Americans reacting to this more recent round of executive actions?
We'll have results on the specific Harvard policy soon, but we have asked whether or not how Americans feel generally about international students contributing to the country, and have found that opinion is very positive. So 67% of Americans say that international students generally have a positive contribution to the country. Only about 10% say it's negative. And even among Republicans, more perceive a positive impact than a negative one. So at least broadly, there are positive views, I would say, towards that. And we also asked whether or not it's acceptable for the government to block a university's ability to enroll international students in order to pressure a university to comply with its demands. That's how we ended up wording it, rather than making it specifically about Harvard. And on that question specifically, Americans were far more likely to, more than twice as likely to say that doing so is unacceptable than to say that it is acceptable. And even among Republicans on that as well, there was more who said it was acceptable, but there was a divide, whereas we might see less of a divide on other issues.
We see over time that there's often a trend in Americans will say, they maybe support the Republican Party, but when you ask about individual policies, they maybe support the Democratic Party more. I mean, that has been shaken up a little bit as as Trump has, moderated on some issues like Social Security and Medicare, and then other things have become more salient, like immigration. But like the maxim in American politics is that we are global conservatives and sort of more, when you get into the specifics of it, we're liberals. So when it all comes down to it, how much does this policy specific level polling really matter? Like, what are we getting out of all of this, to ask the real question here?
Well, I think that to some extent, people are already wanting to be responsive to voters ahead of midterms. I think that that's an aspect of it. And the budget, a lot of these policies, if they are enacted one way or another, are going to become issues in these campaigns, and which way the members of Congress line up on it are going to matter. So I mean, I think there's like straightforward kind of electoral implications. There is, I think, sometimes like kind of a strange use of polling during a presidential term, especially early, where it's like, oh, the president must be in a lot of trouble because their approval ratings are down, or their approval ratings on the economy, or their policy approval, like we're polling, because there isn't a presidential election for a while, and at least for now we have term limits. So to the extent that the president and his administration wants to do things, he doesn't necessarily have to be as responsive to public opinion, except maybe a general desire to keep those numbers up. But it could certainly affect the party downstream. I do think that, like, to some extent, what people say about what they think about certain policies does affect and should affect whether they go forward and in what form. So it's some of these things may not happen because of reactions to them, or they may get changed. And then as pollsters, we also like to track over time. So it is a way to sort of measure how people are maybe changing their views. Maybe there's some Trump voters who come around to certain positions they never supported or never even thought about, let's say on Greenland and the Panama Canal, because now the person they voted for is taking those positions. So I don't know if that's particularly satisfying, but those are some of the things that I think about with these numbers and the effects they could have.
I was just testing you. I support polling. Poll everything is my opinion. No. Let's move on and talk about that polling that I mentioned you did on Americans' self-perceptions. But first, a break. Today's podcast is brought to you by you, the listener. As I mentioned earlier, when you become a paid subscriber at gdpolitics.com, there's a little message box you can fill out explaining why you chose to subscribe. Now, one of those main themes was rigor. Another theme was that through all the data and politics, we try to laugh a little bit too. James says, I really want to support you because I love how you talk about politics. I like how you talk about data, perception versus reality through polling, and I love your humor. Jesse says, I love Galen's witty personality and sensible takes. I mean, come on, witty personality, sensible takes, put that on my dating app. I'm a politics junkie that prefers the shows I watch to be fun and informative. Whatever Galen has planned, I just know it's going to be good. John says, I really enjoyed your work to date. The analysis was data-driven with humor and rigor. Hard to find in today's opinion swamp. Brendan says, I love hearing Galen go into the weeds of the science and art of surveying the public. His enthusiasm and humor are consistently endearing to this listener. And lastly, Rachel says, I really want to support you because I believe in you and I love you and you're my favorite cousin. Okay, well, this is actually from my cousin Rachel, and I'm glad to hear that I'm her favorite. We'll keep that between us. Hopefully, none of the other cousins are listening to the podcast. Anyway, join these listeners by becoming a paid subscriber today at gdpolitics.com. In fact, do it right now. We will be here when you get back. That's gdpolitics.com, and thank you. All right, you all had the audacity to ask Americans about their self-perceptions compared to the average on a whole host of characteristics and abilities. So, do Americans think they are trustworthy? Do they think they're loyal? How about good at driving, or smart, or good at math, good at cooking, good at running even? And you also, of course, have the crosstabs where you can see, like, do men or women think they're good at cooking or running? Do men, or even Democrats or Republicans, do they think they're good at running? I like this kind of stuff. I don't know that this informs our politics. I'm sure there's a way you could spin it, but in general, it helps us maybe understand the world around us in a non-political way, which, I'm always game for. What were the overarching trends that you found in terms of how Americans conceive of themselves?
Americans are much more likely to think they're above average than below average. I don't know. The Lake Wobegon.
Cue the USA chants here.
A lot of self-love.
Yeah, self-love.
One striking. So, some of the ones where this is most extreme, I think, are the ones where there's no accepted measure and there's no time in life where you're measured. So, you can't just sort of look around and say, well, my score is actually pretty low on this, so I guess I'm below average. So, trustworthiness is really high. And that seems like one where it's easy to overrate your ability relative to other people because you don't really have a sense of how they compare.
Wholly 77% of Americans said they were above average on the trustworthiness scale, which mathematicians in the audience know that is not possible.
And 3% say below average, also not possible. We did let people say they're about average, and some people chose that. Yeah, and then if you look at running, which you mentioned, that one really struck me because I didn't necessarily think that would be one of the most extreme in the other direction, but it looks like 57% say they're below average in running, and 15% say they're above average, which I guess is
also not possible.
It's not possible, but if you compare yourself to people who run, which is a small subset of the population, or people who run regularly, then you will probably be below average. So yeah, I think while it was 51 out of the 60 categories, I think people were more likely to say above than below average, whereas they should balance out. And then there were gender splits, as you hinted at. Men were generally more likely to say above average than women were, but it wasn't universal by any means, but it was kind of disappointingly split around stereotypical lines on a lot of categories.
Wait, you say disappointingly, these are Americans' own self-conceptions. So I guess Americans have either been socialized into viewing themselves across stereotypical lines, or people are truly end up being above or below average on these things because it's what we stress for people. Or you can take the position that it's just what, men or women intuitively want to do. We don't have to get into gender politics here, although we also can. But it was, women said that they were above average at a higher rate than men on being nurturing, on cooking, on empathy, reading, time management, importantly. Men were more likely than women by a significant clip to say they were above average on intelligence. Oof, that's harsh. Self-discipline.
Sense of
what
humor.
else? Sense of humor. All right, guys.
And I like that self-awareness too is on that list.
Self-awareness was on the list. Okay, so Taylor, get in here. Put these men in their place.
I don't know. Men are more likely to think that they're persuasive. I don't know if I'm the right person to weigh in. Yeah, the survey doesn't say anything about the reasons why. We really can't speculate on that. But I do think that when we designed this survey, this was kind of the thing that I was most interested in, was to see these gender gaps. And they kind of bore out how we maybe expected.
And I did say disappointingly, but I guess two things. First of all, I just meant it would be interesting for the story if we had more surprises. That was really, this does make sense, and this does feel like valid results. Some of these gaps are not that big. So yes, more men are more likely to say they're above average in sense of humor. We're talking about 67% versus 53%. Most women still think they're above average in sense of humor. So it's not these giant gulfs. So maybe that is sort of a counterbalance. And yeah,
driving was kind of rude. There was a 15-point gap on driving.
Yeah. And people have grown up in a society that is pushing these as actual gaps, as you said, whatever the actual cause, it does seem to reflect that.
I'm going to take the bold position and say I'm a below average driver. So,
I'm definitely below average.
Here, I'll lead the charge. Any other men out there who want to say that they are lower than average in mechanical ability, athletic ability, self-discipline, mathematic ability? Ooh, there was a really big gap in mathematic ability. Oh, no, it was also 15 percentage points. Yeah. Interesting stuff here. There was also something out there for parents to grab a hold of, which is the difference in how people responded based on whether or not they said their parents complimented them or praised them frequently when they were children. What did you find there?
Yeah, a lot of people find it difficult to take a compliment, and it turns out that that's strongly related to how much they were praised as children, and in a positive direction. The more you were praised, the more you find it easy to take a compliment as an adult, which is like the direction you'd expect. But I was surprised by the strength of the relationship.
Well, and particularly on which topics the relationship was strongest, which were attractiveness, public speaking, charisma, and organization. So you might think that like politicians weren't praised enough as children, and so they need that validation. But perhaps they were praised too much.
Yeah, we really should look at this by occupation. I'd be curious to see those, like comedians would be an interesting one.
Right. Like, is this a result of too much praise or too little?
Well, public speaking is one of the ones where people were relatively not very confident in their own abilities overall. So, and compared to average. So this is a thing where like they're surrounded by people who don't think they're very good public speakers, and yet they still don't feel very confident about their own abilities. So praising children leads to better, self-assessment on public speaking feels like, a good reason to praise children.
I want to shout out one more survey that you did, which is a survey that you do every year, which is trust in media. I have to imagine that since the entrance of GD politics onto the scene, Americans are far more trustworthy of media. There's a ray of light in the media landscape that wasn't there last year. You're allowed to laugh. Ha, ha, ha. But anyway, full of dad jokes today. What was the top line takeaway, Taylor, from that survey?
Yeah, well, overall, compared to last year, the results have been relatively consistent in terms of which outlets Americans are most likely and least likely to trust. The Weather Channel still tops the list as by far the most trusted news outlet in our survey. Some of the other top outlets, BBC, PBS, Forbes, whereas at the bottom
GD politics.
next year we'll get you in there. And then towards the bottom of the list, National Enquirer has been consistently rated as the least trustworthy news source.
And there was an interesting trend, which is overall, a lot of these outlets experienced an increase in their trustworthy. There were some notable exceptions, ABC and also the Washington Post. But, across the board, it looks like there's increased trust in a lot of these individual outlets. What do you chalk that up to?
I think part of it could be the fact that last year was an election year. So, last year we kind of saw a little bit of a decrease across all these outlets, and this year we saw a little bit of an increase. And I think one possible explanation, which we haven't tested, and I'm not sure how we would test, but is that during an election year, people are watching the news a lot, maybe, and frustrated with the news and the coverage, and may feel a little bit more negatively towards news outlets.
That's the main one I've got. Yeah. I mean, I think based on our experience putting out polling data directly or with media partners, last year it was so much like, is this good or bad for my team? And, why did you push things that way or the other way? And this year I felt like there's a bit more like engagement on the substance. And we're not ourselves a traditional media outlet. We didn't poll about trust in us. But I do think that we have like a little bit of a taste of how people, or at least some people, are consuming news and thinking about news sources when there's a big election versus when there isn't.
And it's worth keeping in mind here, if we want to put a silver lining on the public's relationship to the media, when you ask about trust in media as an institution overall, we know from recent Gallup polling, it's never been lower, or it's almost never been lower. But when you ask about individual organizations, there is a decent amount of trust out there. And so maybe we've become so obsessed with this idea that there's no trust in the media that that's just how everyone responds. But when you ask, like, there are a lot of outlets out there where people feel comfortable getting decent quality information, right? Is that a fair takeaway?
I think one other way to put that is that people generally trust the news that they consume. So we find that users of each of these news outlets, overall in the poll, we ask everyone about all of these sources, regardless of whether or not they use them. But we also break out the results based on whether or not they're users of that news outlet in the past month. And there is where we see like the really big divide of the people who use each outlet. They have a lot more trust in each of them than the people who don't. So I think what could be going on in part is that people have a lot of trust in the news that they consume and a lot of distrust in news outlets that they choose not to consume. So
yeah, and
raining on my silver linings.
No, I think the lining is quite silver because the overall trust scores, even including the people who don't use them, are still on average positive for the ones we poll about. I do think some of what might account for the gap you're describing, Galen, is that the social media scores are not as good, and a lot of people are getting a lot of their news on social media. So they'll feel good about like a traditional news outlet, but then they're actually getting a lot of news from lots of sources, including ones that aren't on our list, through social media or through posts from people they know on social media, and not feeling very good about that. And then there's also just like a big long tail of news and news-like sources that we're not going to be able to include because not enough people know about them. And my guess is those average trust scores are quite a bit lower, and that's some of what people are thinking about when they're reacting to news overall.
Yeah, it is difficult to pull, I'd say, with how fractured the media environments become, with everyone having their own separate news sources that they go to online, or influencers or podcasts, or so I think it gets increasingly difficult to measure over time, I would say.
Yeah. And isn't that the case with so much? But we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you so much, Carl and Taylor, for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Galen.
Yeah, great time.
My name is Galen Druk. I'm in the early days of getting this podcast off the ground, and I appreciate your support in any way possible. Subscribe to GD Politics wherever you get your podcasts, and if you'd be so kind to rate and review us. Maybe even tell a friend about the podcast. Also, importantly, subscribe to the Substack at gdpolitics.com. There you'll get updates on what we're doing, extras, and you can support this project directly. Thanks for listening, and we will see you soon.